Hey, I'm Scott,
And I'm Chris.
and this is Doxologic, where we help you think with your Bible.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Doxologic. And Scott, we are here, but we are only making up half of the total speakers today, man.
That's right.
But how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Chris. How
Yeah?
are you doing?
Doing great.
Good.
It is now mid-January. Hard to believe
Yeah.
as we're recording this, and there's so much going on in this new year. And we're here in part to just celebrate what God has been doing in one of the ministries of Doxa at Eden Classical Academy. So I'll first welcome Mel Korsmo, our head of school. Mel,
So
welcome.
glad to be here.
Yeah, man.
Thank you.
So glad you're here. We're halfway through the school year this week, through the first school year of Eden, and we also have Dr. Quentin Johnston here. Hello, Quentin.
Hi there.
Good to see you, man. It's
good to be here.
So glad you are here, and you are hailing from Orlando, Florida, and we'll talk about how you're actually hailing from not only Orlando, but further away than just that. But
Okay.
so glad that you are with us. You're visiting Eden for the week and just pouring in. Your mentorship has been so tremendously helpful, even to me and to our board. Scott and I, along with James Applegate and Mel, sit on the board of Eden Classical Academy, which got started this year, K to 9, and it is a classical Christian school. And that's really what we're here to talk primarily about, is to introduce people to broadly what is classical Christian education, and then how Eden is seeking to grow in a classical format with school. But you're here, like I said, all the way from Orlando, Florida. Maybe bring the good listeners just up to some speed about who you are, a little bit of your background, and what brought you to the place where you are professionally today.
Yikes.
Yeah, all in about 90 seconds or
90
less.
seconds.
No.
I was born in Scotland. I came to the U.S. in 91 to pursue my Master of Divinity degree. Completed that in Florida, moved up to Illinois, working at the church there. We had a K-12 school, fell in love with K-12 education, and realized that this is what the Lord wanted me to be doing with my life. More or less. I moved back down to Florida actually to be the academic dean of Whitfield College, which was the undergraduate school of the seminary that I graduated from. And then from there, really then moved to a military boarding school, a Christian military boarding school in Mississippi. And then from there to a classical Christian school in Kansas City. And then when was it? 2021, I left there and started working with the Association of Classical Christian Schools, which is the accreditation association for the classical Christian schools around the nation.
Okay. So you work with, we'll just say the acronym ACCS, the Association of Classical Christian Schools.
Right.
And what is your role entail these days there?
My role is as Vice President of Operations and what we call CADE, but basically it has to do with accreditation and the oversight of all of our teaching opportunities, teacher trainings, teacher certification, that kind of thing.
Okay. And you were telling me this morning, we were talking, so Eden's in its first year, and I was asking you about how many schools nationally, at least with ACCS, are also in their first year, and it was approximately.
Yeah, I want to say it's probably between 20 and 30.
Between 20 and 30.
I believe.
And the follow-up number I found interesting. You were saying...
There are about 100 folks who are pursuing the idea of starting another school. It's between 70 and 100. The number moves. Of those, possibly half of them probably will actually make it to day one.
So, Mel, we made it to day one.
Yeah.
And further.
And further, we're halfway through. So not everybody who seeks to do it can get to launch, basically.
Right. There are just so many aspects to that, as you guys have discovered. I mean, you've got to gather together a team. You've got to be in a place that can support the type of thing that you want to do. Frankly, so many people are so concerned with public education in their little area, wherever they might be, even small towns. They're looking for an alternative. They're thinking, what can I do to get my kiddos out of this terrible situation, and suddenly their eyes are being opened as to the possibilities. They see what classical education can do, and they go, I want that. Now how do I go and make that happen?
Yeah.
And not everybody can, not everybody has the skills. Sometimes it's just the Lord's timing is not there.
Skills, support, leadership, all of that.
Yeah,
right?
all of that.
Need to go in.
And,
Financial realities. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, this actually is a good segue into what Christian classical education is. But maybe Scott, just because the vision for this now, Eden has as a school morphed quite a bit. But when you were first exposed to classical education, tell us a little bit about what that was like a number of years ago, 4 years ago, maybe more. Just what did you undergo that got you so passionate to see something like Eden be established?
Yeah. I would say the word that comes to mind is compelled, like I've never been compelled before. School to me was a means to an end. You knew how to play the game to get the grade that you needed to get to the next thing. It lacked sort of the epistemology part of it, the why behind the what, understanding how all of this plays into God's world, and this is God's world, and how do these subjects? I think if it would be tied into the Lord, you would have a lot more passion behind understanding the way things work, is because God's arranged the world in a certain way, and we have these principles that He's woven into the fabric of creation that allow us to study astronomy and mathematics and music and all of these things. And so it becomes so much more profound instead of really just more of a utilitarian aspect to education, which is basically we're going to make you useful. And that's the sum total of who you are as an individual, what you do, right? And so we're always looking, even at parents, that sometimes the trap is merely to identify your child by helping them figure out what they're going to do. And I think the question that's missing is, who are they becoming?
Yep.
Who are they as a person? Who are they as in Christ ultimately, right? Is the goal that you want to get your kids to. And obviously you're evangelizing your kids to begin, of course, but I just began to see with classical education that they were really putting a tangible piece to Ephesians 6:4 as well, which is the fathers don't, exasperate your children, but raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. What does that look like? And how does that extend into building out just a holistic worldview that includes not only school, but the formation of their character and wisdom and those kind of things.
And so, Quentin, I'd love Mel just jump in as well as Quentin gets going here. What is it? What is classical Christian education that compelled Scott and compels so many other people? But what do we mean if we use the phrase would be CCE, but classical Christian education? What is it?
Well, I think something that you said, Scott, is important. That when I would interview parents before they came to my school, one of the first questions I would ask them is, who do you want your child to become?
Yes.
And I would get two responses. One would go, well, I want him to be a doctor. Or I want him, and so they immediately go to the usefulness of the thing. But the people who really got what I was saying would stop for a second and go, oh, I've never really thought about that. In terms of their character, in terms of this arrow that they're going to set fly into the future. And so classical Christian education really is the education, if you will, that built the Western civilization. Moving from the Greeks to the Romans, the Christianization when the faith became ubiquitous, applying Christian principles to that, and so understanding that we become wholly human when we are involved in Christ and where Christ becomes a part of us. And so developing a whole education that works with the flow of who we are and how we are. And so, the Greeks talked about the transcendentals of truth, goodness, and beauty. Well, what does that mean? Well, we find the Godhead and truth, goodness, and beauty in the Godhead. We find, again, something you mentioned earlier, but Dorothy Sayers wrote a wonderful book called The Mind of the Maker. And what she was trying to help us understand is that if this world is made by a personal God, and that person is creating it as he intends to, then there's nothing in the world that can be abstracted from who he is. And so we can look at the world, we can look at all parts of it, including our education, including how we think and how we speak, and we can bring the Lord God of hosts to that, and understand that everything that we do is part of his intention for us as individuals. So classical Christian education is taking this wonderful, thoughtful, God-centered view of the world, and theology, of course, being the queen of the sciences, and developing people to, as Milton said, to repair the ruins of our first parents, and learning to get to know the God aright. And so it brings to bear all of the wisdom of those ages right now, today, and teaches young people how to think, how to become virtuous, how to live a life, an intellectual life that is truly honest in terms of the world that they find themselves in, created by a gracious and good God.
That's fantastic. I'll say, when you think through the word compelled, the word that comes to mind, if I was to put it in one word, awakened is the word that comes to mind for me. I say that word because I was starting a PhD at the same time as my children had just started what really, at the most trivial perspective, I understood, okay, here's a program that has as its vision to know God and make him known. I went, oh, that's fascinating. Love the vision of that. Didn't understand the classical component, but we're all in. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, so I'm going through a PhD in the secular, progressive, critical theory, its own birthplaces for a critical racer, and all these things happening at the same time in this juxtaposition as we're doing homeschooling classically and realizing, wait, these are so opposite. What is going on? And like you, wanting to go, this PhD, I thought I would be so fascinated by it. I'm actually more interested in what my kids are doing. And what was really interesting
how they're learning.
Oh, totally.
Right?
How they were learning. And,
Yeah.
and what I found really fascinating was to be able to take the ideas more so from the classical side of things and to pull those into the classroom less than the actual PhD components. One of the things that I find really helpful in thinking about the term classical Christian education is to disaggregate that composite of three words. And to start with the last one first, that being the noun and the other one's modifying it, and to think through education and going, okay, well, what is the telos of that? What is the end? And this is what you're alluding to in a large sense. And when you think through what is the end of education, most would say in a pragmatic, utilitarian side of things, well, it's to, and there's a friend of mine who did this, he would call it so that project. And he would think through and he would just take that multiple times. And if you think, and you'd say, so that what? Well, I'm gonna do this education so that I can get better grades, as you mentioned. Okay, so that what? So you can get into a better college. So that what? So that you get a better job. So that what? And as you take that 5 or 6 rounds, you wind up realizing how it is completely pragmatic and frankly worldly, bluntly. To go to a different component, education has as it tell us a very different thing, rather than simply acquisition of information or knowledge. Knowledge is important, but it does not stop there. It rather progresses to understanding and to wisdom, and this gets at that soul formation. So rather than information, about soul formation, that would be the education word. And then if we progress to Christian, then we're saying, okay, this is the notion that we get at in everything Christ is preeminent. The reality is, as we have from our school verse, and there's a reason we very intentionally, as you know, selected that one to look at Romans 11:33-36, for from him, and ending in 36, for from him and through him and to him are all things, to him be the glory forever. Amen. Well, okay, so every subject is created by him. Every subject also reflects back to his glory, and every subject is sustained by him and brings him glory and praise. And to not have that embedded continually in your curriculum well, you may say that you have a neutral worldview, but as I always argue, I think when I say awaken is illuminate, there is no such thing as neutral education.
Right.
Just
There's
doesn't
no
exist.
neutrality in general.
Yes.
In terms
right.
of the world, politically, religiously, educationally, there's no neutrality.
Right. And then to progress to that next word of classical, and why we go classical Christian education, is this idea that we believe the best way to do that Christian education is a classical approach, and that has many, many layers within it that I think we can really tease out in further discussion of what are the key elements of classical education and how that begins to play out. But that's I think it's just helpful to disaggregate it and then put it back together and say this is what we're talking about.
So to summarize, and maybe you guys can just phenomenal job right there. But how is classical Christian education distinct in some of its goals and some of its values from what could be called a more, well, at least today, more traditional or modern style of education? Like, what are some of the nuances that you would want to tease out so people that are just hearing about this, and I would hope that those last several minutes would be compelling in general, but explain to us some of the differences.
I think it's easy to get caught up in really practical pieces, but ultimately it comes down to the fundamental theological and philosophical difference. We live in a world that is increasingly becoming self-aware of the roots of its own thought. And so we have in our world, as we can see, and certainly in our country, it's very obvious, we're seeing the fruits of a naturalistic world and life view being played out. And as the fumes of the former Christian world and life view are now dissipating, we're now seeing what it really means not to think Christianly, not to think in terms of or not to value people in terms of who they are in God, in Christ. And so the education then, which is a naturalistic education, generally speaking, throughout the nation, produces people who are profoundly unhappy, unwell, but profoundly narcissistic, self-centered, who are at war with any idea that does not comport with the ideas they have at the moment. And so they don't want to enter into a discussion. We're seeing it in our society all the time, that people say, well, this is what I believe. It is what it is. I don't want to hear your discussions. I don't want to have that conversation. Classical education teaches our students to think about both sides. It asks them to think peaceably with people about what they think and to address what they think, to understand the nuances of all the arguments, because they are concerned in loving their neighbor. And part of loving their neighbor is to know how their neighbor thinks, and then to be able to express to their neighbor peaceably what the truth is.
That's so good. And yeah, appreciate that very much, because there's a stigma with homeschooling where homeschooling's all about this fearful protection of our kids. We're going to keep them so they're
The bubble.
sheltered.
The bubble, the
sheltered, not let them hear about those. They don't want to hear those opposing views. And that's fundamentally that's the opposite of what you're saying. We're actually training up students to be able to engage with all the worldly philosophies that they're going to find in the world. And we are not shy about that at all, giving them the tools to be able to think through those things. So it's actually not a fear tactic at all. It's more of an equip and deploy tactic, ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, rhetoric is the art of peaceable difference.
Yeah.
And so the ability to be able to express a different point of view, but peaceably, loving your opponent, as it were, the one with a different point of view, loving them so much that you're prepared to understand what they believe and then address it, and carefully and thoughtfully. That is so needed in today's society, and sadly, we see it on our news screens on a daily basis. The need for it.
Right.
Those habits of, as we would call them, some of the literature would speak to the idea of embodied practices, which fancy term to really talk to habits of heart and mind, those rhythms that you begin to develop. And this is what we're training. So we have, for example, logic classes. Well, what is logic?
What's the stage, though? So folks who don't know.
So stages, but also, and we'll speak to this would be a logic class, but you also have a logic age. And this is that's an element from Dorothy Sayers, who you mentioned earlier, who has a article that was captured in the late 40s, speaking about the lost tools of learning. And so she brought back to attention, very usefully and helpfully, the notion of the trivium. And this being from a Latin phrase, Trivium, ways, 3 ways and key ways of thinking about things. And actually this ties back to, I would argue, the Garden of Eden. If you think about what the trivium is, grammar, logic, rhetoric, each of these are tools, frankly, of words, of speaking. In contrast to the Quadrivium, which we can talk about later as another element in the 7 noble arts, but going just to the trivium and what logic would be. Her argument, in essence, there are also 3 stages of learning. These coincide with where our kids' brains as they're developing, and perhaps some of the rigidity in her statement, where I think some people have refined this over time, or at least contested it, is to say it's a little bit more fluid between the ages. Now we do have a grammar program, which would be K through 6, our logic program 7th through 9th, and then as we would develop out a rhetoric program 10th to 12th. And the idea is not that they're not practicing the skills of rhetoric at the grammar ages of K through 6, but rather they're at a rudimentary sense, a very original sense. And the brain, though, is beginning to, so if you think of grammar as the building blocks that you then can begin to make connections between. So a building block might be that you memorize the commutative law of mathematics, or the commutative law of addition, or the commutative law of multiplication. A plus B equals B plus A times B equals B times A. And you don't know necessarily what to do with that, but you have that memorized. That would be the grammar of that subject. Now, taking it to the logic step, you would be able to actually put that into application. You'll be able to reason with it and do things with it. And then at the rhetoric stage, you're able to, as Quentin was articulating really well, in a winsome way, to be able to convince or to be able to provide and persuade of an argument in either one of 2 formats, because those come in 2 formats, of a written format or in speaking. And this would be at the rhetoric age. Now, again, those aren't with the rigidity that I think Dorothy Sayers perhaps overemphasized and people adopted a bit too much, but this is what we're talking about of logic.
Generally speaking, the way a child develops into adolescence
goes through each of those.
Is that by 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, particularly if the foundation's been there for a number of years, to see them be ready to do that persuasion, having the grammar stage, the logic stage, and as it kind of starts to click, call it 15, 16, 17. Again, we're speaking in generalities the way we do, but that's where you really see the payoff. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the payoff of those foundational elements really flourish in that latter stage.
You see this a lot in some of the videos that go viral. You have people who want to make persuasive arguments, but they can't, because they can't think logically. They've not learned how to create a syllogism. They've not learned how to reason deductively, or frankly even inductively. So all they can do is make a pronouncement. They can make a statement, and then they back it up with emotional arguments, not with reasoned arguments. And the wonderful thing about classical education is it starts with teaching students how to read well. And as Christian classical educators, of course, the one thing over everything else we want our children to do is to be able to read the scriptures well. Christianity is the faith of the book. God didn't give us a musical score. He didn't give us a color painting. He gave us words. Well, it's incumbent upon us to understand those, to learn them, to understand what they mean, to understand the grammar, the nuance of them, and then to be able to use those words and to create and to understand arguments, positive and negative, and then to be able to articulate those well. And all that comes down to helping our students love the scriptures and to be able to reason from them to the situations that they find in the world and in their own lives.
I had one other element back to Trivium, which is fascinating to me, is that everybody, any subject that you struggled in, likely is because you were forced to advance past one of those elements, that you didn't understand the grammar of the subject, and you
Yes.
had to advance to the logic
Yes.
of it.
Yes.
Or you didn't understand the logic of it, and you had to advance to the rhetoric level of it. It also that's one reality. Another reality is that is how everybody learns any subject. So a person at our age can learn something new, gardening, metalwork, whatever the subject is. You're going to start with what is the grammar of that subject? What are the terms and the ideas and the key concepts?
fundamentals,
the definitions,
right?
the
Yeah.
fundamentals, and you're going to start with that, and then you're going to begin to build off of that into different skill sets until you might become not just experienced in, but actually able to instruct others. So this concept actually applies at any age. It also has the beauty that it sits, and again, I'd refer to that Romans 11:33 to 36, that starts out with, oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. So if we take those ideas, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, in my mind, they have a strong corollary. If we go from grammar to logic to rhetoric, to also go from knowledge to understanding to wisdom. And that so grammar, getting at those key concepts, fundamentals, this would be those knowledge steps. You're not necessarily doing something with it. At logic stages, you're now getting into the dialectic and the reasoning. And what do I do with this? That's an understanding of it.
And if
And
anybody's
then-
had junior hires, this is exactly what they're doing naturally.
Right.
Yes, right.
Asking why. I mean, now
Why?
little
And
kids
they're
ask
contending,
why a
and they're
lot too.
arguing.
But at 13 years old ish,
Right.
12 to 14,
It's why with tools,
Yes.
though. It's why
Yes,
with
right.
tools.
they want to understand, why is it like this?
And that's a good
why,
thing.
Why am I like this? Why is the world like this? Things like that are
Yeah,
just
we think it's
natural.
unnatural, but it's actually a really good thing to embrace.
And for the parents to embrace
Yes.
that, right? As
Yes.
their kids are,
and we train them in, we're training in logical fallacies, which so we're training the art of reasoning, but also in the art of making a good argument. What does a good argument look like? What do those syllogisms look like? And then what does a logical fallacy look like? What does it look? What is bad reasoning? Now the challenge is that then parents need some training on that too.
No doubt.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
you're
I
listening,
feel
well,
that.
You
I
had
feel
this.
that.
You had an ad hominem. That was a red herring or whatever.
Yeah.
It's fallacious. You're like, I'm not equipped.
Where am I
Anyhow.
sending you to school?
Why are they teaching these things?
But I will say something from the parent's perspective to what you're talking about with the Trivium is you miss the grammar stage, you're going to struggle in logic. You miss the logic stage, you're going to struggle in rhetoric. That piece that you were,
Yes.
the point that you were making there. If I go back into my own public school, that fundamentally describes so much of, they just passed you on, whether they really assessed you understanding and grasping the dynamics of just the basic constituent parts of any subject, right?
Yes.
And so it's like your grade's okay. They weren't asking any other questions, and you're moving on. But see, kids like me, you knew how to, like I said earlier, play the game. So you knew how to keep moving on. But eventually you got outed where you're like, it's getting more difficult because I'm missing fundamental building blocks that would lead me to using this and leveraging it in the way now I'm being asked in a future grade. Those kind of things.
Now, fascinating conversation. Let me ask this coincident of use. So, the Trivium in particular, grammar, logic, rhetoric, as a philosophical approach with the Quadrivium. In brief, because I know so much can be said, but what is that learning dynamic that we call the Quadrivium?
Well, the Quadrivium used to be what students started to learn age 14 or so. Okay. And that's when many of them went to what we would now consider college. And there they're learning arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And nowadays with astronomy, we often substitute physics because the rules are very similar. But nevertheless, the idea again here is to think about number, and right. these are the mathematical arts. And so when we talk about music in particular, we're not talking about the skill of learning to play something, but we're really talking about understanding what music is in terms of its math and its intervals and so forth. It's a completely different way of thinking about music. Mm-hmm. most classical schools deal somewhat with the quadrivium. Very few right now have astronomy classes, but we all have physics classes. But we want to, again, help our students understand math, not just simply as something to be done, but something that is, again, truly beautiful. If I can tell a story, I had one of my math teachers in my last school was standing at the back of the class, and they were working through something some calculus problem, and suddenly one of her good students just slammed her pen down on her desk, and Sarah thought, "Oh no, what's going on here?" And after a second, this student said, "That is beautiful."
Oh.
I'm sorry, about what subject?
Calculus.
Got it. Okay, never done that in my life.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That is confusing. That is frustrating. I've never said that is beautiful,
Right.
but
and,
okay.
and I think that's part of what we're trying to recover.
Yes.
We're trying to recover
That's a great point.
that mathematics is beautiful.
It comes
is
together.
the language of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
I once talked to a fellow who believed in aliens and all the rest of it, and we had some interesting conversations. And finally, I said to him, "Look, I think we can agree on this: that if there are Klingons out there, their mathematics is the same as ours. For them, 1 and 1 must equal 2. And as soon as I said that, it kind of shut the conversation down, because suddenly he realized, oh, wait a minute, this is back to this universe created by a single mind. And that was unacceptable. But it's interesting. So we are trying in terms of recovering those quadrivial arts to help our students begin to love mathematics. Few of us say, well, I'm not a reading person, or, I'm not a drawing person. But how many times have we heard students say, well, I'm not a math person? And I think it comes down to something you said, Mel, is that we've passed students through. They've learned the mechanics. They've done their speed drills. They've done all that, but they've not really understood number theory. They've not really understood what it is, what this number is. That it's real. It's not it's not just a name. But it's actually a real thing in God's real universe.
Yeah. Wow.
And so, beginning to help students understand that and then relate that. Is again one of the areas I think that classical Christian education is increasingly beginning to recover. I think the next 50 years we're going to see some interesting developments in that.
That's interesting that you say that. I can remember in college, I have so much more respect now for like a math major than I used to, because I used to say the moment you started writing papers about math is when I checked out of the conversation, because they ended up getting well beyond where I was willing to go and where I wasn't trained. I was only trained in get the right answer, but as soon as the calculator was able to be used in class, okay, good. And I could just move on to just pure utility, right? Like whatever I need to do to get the right answer to move me on so I don't have to keep doing this.
Yep.
And I have much more respect for the mind, which we all have a capability of, but this particular mind that God gives to some to really understand the universe in that mathematical sense.
That's really good. I wanted to return to that you had a question about distinctives, and something you just said is so important to highlight as a distinctive of classical Christian education. I would go to 2 words, very similar though in some sense: wonder and delight. Mm-hmm. That there is that's what that described, right? The one who goes, oh, this is beautiful. We want that in all of these different subjects, and not just that it ends actually there, but it goes, oh, why is it so beautiful? Because it's in a universe. Well, who made that universe? This is something that brings us back to an exaltation and to praising the Lord. This is why we sit there as we thought through a motto. We went Latin phrase, non nobis domine. Not to us, O Lord. It comes from Psalm 115:1. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory, for the sake of your steadfast love and your faithfulness. It's to him that we're exalting and just proclaiming his goodness and his faithfulness and that continuity. I mean, these are what they often will say as you look through. There's a great book, actually, it's by Susan Wise Bauer, I think it's called The Story of Science, speaks about disabuses those who were saying, no, Enlightenment had nothing against, they were actually against what God was saying. But if you dig into Kepler and what he was driven by, for example, and he would speak to, no, I knew that I could find key ideas and concepts because of a God who orchestrated and designed this with an order and a discipline. Therefore, it can be discovered through process and through reasoning and through logic, and that's where he arrives to that point. So that was one point. And then the other one that I was highlighted to is, you think about the term liberal arts, and
that, to be clear, is
so
the seven
liberal
components
arts
that you've discussed.
Right.
The trivium
plus
the quadrivium, that gives you seven.
Yes,
Boom.
that gives you 7.
Yeah.
So that word liberal, though, like, okay, what are we talking about? What does that mean? We have liberal that gets used in a lot of different definitions, and we actually need to go to the Latin base of that, and it's libere. Okay, well, what is libere? Well, it's about freedom. It's about being free. So the idea of the liberal arts was this is your starting point, not the end point. This is your starting point to be a free person, not enslaved mentally, so that you can go forth in a life as God has it and to live abundantly.
So good.
That's how you get those liberal arts are the starting point from which if you don't have them, to your point of going, calculus, math, whatever that is, now you wind up with either a crutch or needing a mental, we'll call it a disability or a handicap of some sort, that you now do not have the same freedom that you should have. And then it makes it more difficult. If you have mastered those 7 liberal arts, now you are liberated, in a sense, to go into these other things. That would be the philosophies of nature, of the social sciences, of, frankly, divine philosophy, and getting into theology, the mother of all philosophies.
Or of all sciences.
Or all sciences, thank you. But it gets you to that. So this is, that word libere is such a key component as to understand what we're talking about with the liberal arts. One other thought on the quadrivium that I love. If we took the trivium, we said is about words. And then if we go to the quadrivium, we say numbers and sounds. Shapes. Numbers and shapes. It means sounds. Numbers and shapes. So numbers, we get arithmetic. And then we see the numbers in the most simple form, but then we see numbers in motion and in music. That's how we get the music component. And then geometry, we have shapes. But if we think astronomy, what is that about? Oh, that's shapes in motion. And in 3D. And this is how you get to Kepler's laws and other laws about what motion looks like, of interplanetary motion, which has that physics draw to it as well.
No surprise, time just flying on us for so much that we could address, and we already are. I love it. But Quentin, I want to ask this. When people hear about classical Christian education, hopefully feeling, compelled, even interested, but what are some of the objections that people will often give? Some buts. Give us 2 to 3 common but this about my kids, or maybe their future, or something about that's not going to work in the real, whatever it might be. What are some of those?
I think the one I've heard the most is, well, this is for really smart kids. And my kid's just an average kid. I mean, but the reality is, experience tells us in classical Christian schools that actually, if anything, this is education for the average kid. Smart kids are going to be smart. Sure. God has given kids, given some people just tremendous intellects, but what classical Christian education does is it, in teaching skills and combining that with virtue, which is critical to the growth of a student and to their development, it means that even students who might otherwise struggle have learned skills to apply, have learned habits of moral habits, if you will, of diligence and fortitude and perseverance and so forth, and temperance. And so they apply that to their studies, and surprise, surprise, they do well. So the first thing is, no, this is not an elitist education just for the brilliant. It really, truly is an education for all. A lot of people will also say, well, that's all right, but why would you possibly learn Latin? I mean, my kid needs to learn Chinese because they're
The way
gonna
the
take
world's
over
going
world.
right
That's
now,
the way
yeah,
the world's going. They're going to learn, or well, that's no use. They need to learn Spanish because or whatever. But the reality is, teaching Latin teaches them English, amongst other things. It teaches them to think in a certain way. It trains the mind in a certain way, and then allows them to think and to explore their own English language in a much fuller way. So perhaps I'll stick with those. Those are two, but the first one I think being the one that most people will often go, yeah, but that's not my kid.
One other one that I know I've engaged with some, not only the exclusive by way of the brilliant kid, but it's just the way you're talking about it seems kind of hoity-toity. It just seems like it's flaunting a superiority, and in so doing, because let's admit, we believe this is the best style of education for the glory of God. We can say that, but it sounds like in raising this up, it sounds like you're also just bashing everybody else, who can't do it. How do you engage with people that might be on the defensive? They're not able to enter into classical education in this moment, or there's not an opportunity, and they just get prickly with it sometimes. How do you engage with people on that level, on a superiority type of claim?
Again, I think it comes down to helping them understand that just because we are saying something is great and brilliant and very useful doesn't necessarily mean to say that we're casting aspersions upon their abilities to provide for their families. I've often said to parents who have wanted to come to my school, but even with the scholarships that we were providing just couldn't make it, and try to help them understand that in God's providence, this is where they are. That God's providence isn't just when you're rich and God has blessed you, but it's sometimes when you're poor and He has limited your the opportunities. Well, what are you going to do with that? How are you going to bend the knee to God in that and say, Lord, this is what I believe I would like. I can't afford that right now. Now, help me to find a way of doing that. Help me to perhaps homeschool, perhaps getting into a co-op. But I think it's important to try to help people understand just because one thing is good doesn't mean to say that the other thing is, and the people involved in it are necessarily bad.
And it's the heart behind it, right? Wanting to communicate that.
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking through as well, what do we share in common? And to revert to that as a good and healthy place that reconciles some of perhaps what might be momentary differences in the course that we decide to take for that. And by that I mean to go actually back where you were when we think through Deuteronomy, think through Ephesians 6, and we're talking about how we're aiming to raise up our children. Okay, we're raising up our children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And you go back to that root word, paideia, and when you get to that, you're at not just education, but enculturation. And the question is, how do we share that in common? That's such a good and healthy spot in my mind to return to, and that there are a number of different methods where the Lord provides opportunities, avenues, convictions at different times and different places for us to pursue, but all to share in common that this is a responsibility, a direction that we can't just outsource or offload to somebody else, but rather that we as parents, and especially we as dads, have to and must engage in, not to our kids' exasperation, as to your point, but rather to thoughtfully, prayerfully, intentionally pursue this to the glory of God.
Two more questions, and we'll close in a few here. Obviously, classical Christian education is very popular in the homeschool community, nationally, probably internationally. But how do schools uniquely aid parents in achieving the goals of classical Christian education in the home with the family, with the children? How does a school aid parents in this?
So many thoughts come to mind. I think the first fundamentally is to help them understand that they are participating in something quite unique in this world and quite wonderful, that we are recovering something that is lost. And so we are on a journey together. So most schools that I know of will have some kind of family outreach program. They will, in my school, actually, I employed somebody as we called our family outreach educator. And then I discovered that the acronym of that was FO, which is exactly the opposite of what I wanted.
FOE, yeah.
But nevertheless, but what that individual did was to reach out to our families, to draw them into the conversation. So we would have fireside chats, we would have book clubs, we would have ways of drawing them into the discussion about their child's education. Not everybody's going to do that. Very few actually, statistically, do that, but it's enough to provide this platform that others then get to ask questions of the more informed. So we want to try to encourage our parents to come with us, to watch what their children are doing. I think one of the things that I hear so many times from parents is, my kid's only been at school for a week and already fill in the blank, or it's only the first semester and I can't believe, and my neighbors are saying, or whatever. And that then encourages that conversation to say, well, why don't you go read this book or read that or think about this or listen to that podcast, so that they can be better informed about the philosophical and theological, pedagogical underpinnings of this amazing thing that's happening to their children. And the more intentional I think a school can be about that, the more likely they are for parents to stick it out when it gets hard, because it will get hard, especially as children get older and they become, they have more decision making regarding their own schooling, and for parents to say, no, this is what we're going to do, because, and then lay out the reasons why as a family this is what they're going to do. So reaching out as much as possible, I think, is helpful.
Mel, let me turn it over to you as our head of school.
Sure.
Briefly. Mel, look at me. Briefly, brother.
Always,
Briefly,
else.
brother, okay? I love you. How does
That was uncalled for, Ritter.
I know. I'm sorry, Mel. How are you representing Eden? Because we have more leaders and teachers, of course, seeking to come alongside the parents in this first year.
Sure. I'll start with the word recovering that lost tools of learning and how necessary it is. There are a number of things that we can improve on and that we need to actually continue doing. So important to realize that this is a paradigm shift. And I start with that word because it's a paradigm shift for us. We typically have not grown up with this educational method. The methods, the ideas, the why, how, and what are completely different. So it is a massive paradigm shift. We have to have our own education, in a sense, recovered. I like to say my education has been redeemed because of this in going through the process. That means we do it in community. That means we're doing it in collaboration. How are we doing it at Eden? Okay, you're coming here for 2 to 2.5 days, depending on grammar or logic, students and what ages those are, but we're alongside it. We're absolutely inviting parents into that to come and join us. And with something we'll be aiming to do in the future, and just commit to in this sense, even here, is to say more articles and information, more nights that we have that training and engagement, so that this is what this looks like, and here's how to do this.
Like a version of an open house.
Yes.
So for people...
Well, so there's that, which is for those who are new to it. This would be an open house, and we do have a number of those. We will have those coming up in February,
different
March, and
than
April. Different than that. That would be for somebody brand new to this. But for those who are in it,
Yes.
who have already said, no, I want this, and my students are here, okay, that's really matters. And how do we come alongside those families? There
Provide
are a number
greater
of
tools.
Greater tools, and there really is becoming, I think we're on just the cusp of so many of those sources coming out. And so we'll be passing along those different podcasts that come, different resources to read. We have provided a number of books, but okay, let's actually engage with those books together and have a discussion. Not just pass a book to you, but let's engage in that conversation as well.
Quentin, as we close here, I'd love to just hear what would be your final pitch to parents feeling compelled by this vision of classical Christian education, but also feeling maybe unsure of the commitment that might take to transition to this. What would be your concluding pitch to somebody seriously considering this?
I think the question is the answer. once one is compelled, truly compelled, you can't unsee what you see. Yes. Once you see it, you can't you can never blot that out, because you've seen a promise. You if you like, you've seen the celestial city. You've seen something that you're going to now pilgrimage towards. My encouragement would be to evaluate your family circumstances. Evaluate the assumptions you've made about how you're going to use your family time and your family resources. This is not inexpensive.
Yeah.
And we're so used to the idea that education is quote unquote free. The reality is, what is it worth to take hold of this vision that you have seen, and what are you prepared to sacrifice to make it happen? I mean, I've seen families literally move home to smaller homes into lower cost neighborhoods so that they could afford this education. I've seen people who used to drive BMWs drive 10-year-old minivans because they were compelled by, this is a vision. I'm going to move heaven and earth to make this happen one way, shape, or form. But I think once you see it, I would encourage you to pursue it, and to rethink, if necessary, the assumptions you've made about your, as I say, your family resources, whether that's in time, whether that's in personnel, whether that's in finances.
Wow.
So good.
It's good. Very good. Thank you, brother. Any closing words, Pastor Scott?
Yeah, it just comes back to that compelled piece, right? There's so much there. I mean, I listen to the story, I'm like, that's Eden.
Sure.
Right? Like, we're nuts. We started a school, right? But off that vision, it just could not shake the found, especially being a church that glorifies God by making disciples. It's like, we put our money where our mouth is. Let's go for this. It's worth it.
Yes.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate your time with us. It's really a
Pleasure.
joy to have you. I mean, when I'm around as seasoned of people as you are, and professionally in this, and also with your family, Mel, for now 11 or 12 years, it is so compelling. Keeps coming up. It's motivating. It is. It just helps shape my own family's just future goals. And so I hope, listener, as you've heard this, that this is helping those of you already involved in this, or at least prompting those of you who maybe knew the outer edges of this, understand a little more. What are the aims? What are the distinctives? And how might the Lord be calling you into something like this? And if that's maybe at Eden Academy someday, if that's in a homeschool co-op someday that's separate from another institution, there are plenty of good opportunity, to the point of how much not only ACCS, but other organizations are growing like crazy right now. Get involved in this. Pray, seek the Lord on how He might have this shape your future as well as a family. So thank you for sticking with us, and we will see you next time.
You've been listening to Doxologic, a podcast by Doxa Church in Rockland, California. To learn more, visit us online at doxa.church.